Your Excellencies, Honorable Ministers, the President CEO of COL, the Vice Chancellor at Athabasca University, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Promoting equity and inclusion is one of the sub-themes of this conference. This sub-theme is so important that it underpins COL's entire work. And here I'm quoting Aisha, the President of COL. Over the last 2 days, we have listened to distinguished panelists and experts giving their various perspectives and sharing ideas and experiences on this sub-theme in several parallel sessions. So this afternoon, we're delighted to have a keynote speaker. And before I hand over or invite him to take the podium, let me just say a word or two about this sub-theme. Inequality in access to technology for education during the COVID-19 pandemic was visible in many countries. Indeed, the digital divide exacerbated the challenges faced by the marginalized learners and persons with disabilities. Global experience shows that too narrow a focus on technological solutions for teaching and learning may not be the best option for promoting equity and inclusion. It is particularly so when considering that a significant digital gender divide limits women's and girls' rights to equal access to technological solutions. In addition, open and distance learning has always focused on equity and access by adopting a range of technologies such as printed text, radio, television, and the internet. But decisions made in this regard need to be driven by national, institutional, and individual commitment to the principles of equity and inclusion. From this perspective, ensuring equity and inclusion are vital issues before all governments and educational institutions, especially after the experiences of COVID-19. So, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege this afternoon to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, His Excellency Mr. Buti Manamela, Deputy Minister for Higher Education, Science and Innovation of the Republic of South Africa. Mr. Manamela was Deputy Minister for Higher Education and Training, and before that, he served as Deputy Minister in the Presidency, the Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, Youth and Development and Administration. Deputy Minister Manamela has been a Member of Parliament since 2009, serving as Whip of the Labour Portfolio Committee and as a Chief Volunteer for Parliament's Nelson Mandela Day activities. He is a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party. He also served as the National Secretary of the Young Communist League of South Africa from 2003 to 2014, and has also served in various roles in the ANC Youth League, South African Students' Congress, and other student organizations. Deputy Minister Manamela also worked as organizer for the trade union SACAU in 2001. He holds a postgraduate diploma and a Master of Management in Public Policy from the University of Witwatersrand in 2017. So, dear colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Minister Manamela to the podium to deliver his keynote address. Where is he?
Thank you very much, Madam, for that generous introduction. It makes me feel like a rock star coming out of the curtain. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I must say it's an honor for me and on behalf of our country to be part of this conference, but also to present on the key question around promoting inclusion and equity. And probably apt being from a country that is the most unequal in the world. And I hope that our experiences as a country, which is also a reflection of our experiences as a continent and the world, will help us learn some lessons on what needs to be done, particularly to promote access for those who've historically been excluded, particularly young women, young black women all over the world. As the governments of the world continue to grapple with the historical inequalities of their respective education system, in my view, one of the agent research and policy questions of our time is to fully understand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the ability of governments to provide educational opportunities for all. As it relates to the basic education sector in 2021, the World Bank made some important observations to help us understand this new challenge. The World Bank noted that firstly, even before COVID-19 hit, the world was experiencing a learning crisis. 258 million children of primary and secondary education age were out of school, and the learning poverty rate in low and middle income countries was 53%, meaning that over half of all 10-year-old children could not read and understand a simple text, and in sub-Saharan Africa, the figure was closer to 90%. The COVID-19 pandemic, the report further noted, exacerbated the learning crisis and the impact of the human capital of this generation of learners, which is likely to be long-lasting. At the peak of school closures in April 2020, 94% of students, or 1.6 billion children, were out of school worldwide. There was huge uncertainty and anxiety within families as children had to navigate across options of hybrid and remote learning, or in some instances, no schooling at all. Early evidence from several high-income countries have already revealed learning losses and increase in inequality. Young children were particularly at risk since the pandemic exacerbated existing disparities in nutrition, in health, and stimulation, and services to support these children were often overlooked in the pandemic response. The report also noted that the unique nature of the pandemic placed parents as first-line responders for children's survival, care, and learning. And therefore this placed a burden on all families, and especially the most vulnerable. Adding to this global shock to the education system was the negative impact of the unprecedented global economic contraction on family incomes, which increased the risk of school dropouts and also resulted in the contraction of government budgets and strains on public education spending. And I think most of us may have experienced in different quarters of the world where governments had to readjust their national budgets in order to focus resources towards responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. The extended school closures, together with this economic downturn, was a twin unprecedented shock to education. Even more concerning was the observation that due to learning losses and increase in dropout rates, the current generation of students stand to lose an estimated $10 trillion in earnings, or almost 10% of global GDP. Countries will be driven even more off track to achieving their learning poverty goals, potentially increasing learning poverty levels to 63%. So this was mostly in terms of basic education. As it relates to the impact of COVID-19 on the post-school education and training sector, a 2021 analytical report by the European Union also makes a number of important observations which I think are quite helpful for this discussion that we're having. They noted that COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in temporary physical closures of schools and higher education institutions around the world. In higher education, approximately 220 million students globally have been affected due to the disruptions caused by COVID-19, leaving policymakers and educational institutions with unprecedented challenges, such as to mitigate learning losses, but also how to deploy remote learning and how to safely reopen educational institutions, and how to ensure that underrepresented, vulnerable and disadvantaged learners are not left behind. And I think the confusion that the pandemic pushed us into made us obviously to panic, not to know when to reopen our education institutions, not to know how to deploy resources adequately to respond to the pandemic, but as to whether, if we reopen our institutions too early, will we not be compromising lives? Or if we open them too late, will we not lose valuable time in terms of learning and teaching, particularly in countries where reaching students through online or open learning became almost difficult because of the strain in terms of resources. The COVID-19 pandemic has already had an unprecedented impact on higher education worldwide and virtually all aspects of its functioning. In the academic year 2019-20, the pandemic transformed the way teaching took place, accelerating transformation that was already taking place in the form of online learning and teaching. So in as much as this was a crisis, it was also an opportunity to push many of us to readjust almost into permanency ways within which we can improve learning and teaching and moving more towards open learning, online learning, and distance learning education, or put differently, a blended form of learning. The pandemic has also had a direct impact on how research is carried out, on university operations in terms of campus closures and the shift to online learning, and also on university governance, with management staff needing to take a range of emergency decisions and allow additional flexibility in many areas of activity. And also, the report from the EU also noted that the pandemic has also highlighted the importance of universities' community engagement, because universities have to be rooted in communities, because they were not immune from what was happening outside of the university borders, but also that because universities are such a nucleus in terms of literacy levels, cognitive levels, as it relates to the students who were attending in those universities, it meant that universities and most post-school education and training institutions have to play a role as commissars and agents in order to engage with communities on the impact of COVID-19. All this serves as a sobering reminder to us as policymakers and researchers that the provision of inclusive and equal education opportunities is not merely about assisting individuals to realize their private aspirations. And therefore, we had to act. And what kind of actions that many of us had to be involved into, and I think some of the decisions that we took at that time were almost common based on our availability to and access to resources and the capacities of different countries. And I think the first default was obviously the use of technology to save the academic year. In fact, our theme in South Africa was save lives and save the academic year, and that no one should be left behind. As I said, in our country, our post-school education and training sector, like the rest in the world, has obviously been affected by the pandemic, and therefore we had to exacerbate the teaching and learning crisis, and the impact on the human capital of this generation of learners is, as I said, going to be long-lasting. And saving the academic year with balancing saving lives as our priority, but also it has changed life as we know it, but it has also taught us that some important lessons, especially about the integration of information communications technology into teaching and learning, and how lecturers and students use and apply ICT. We've seen in our country, beyond central government's interventions and some of the initiatives that were taken by provincial governments, the most innovative ways and means to survive COVID-19 came from educators and or lecturers and their students, and the available mode of communications that were at their disposal And we thought, and I think that this was probably one of the most important intervention where people who were on the ground, in the classrooms or at home, took initiative to innovate ways and means within which they can continue learning and teaching without leaving anyone behind. The use of technology, the use of digital and technological solutions in education and training has also been upfronted for ensuring education and training continuity in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. One other element which obviously played a role, an impact in our education, and therefore also played a role in terms of inclusion and equity, was the whole question of vaccination. We have established some years ago an agency which is called Higher Health, which is looking into and was quite instrumental to help us to respond to health and wellness issues during the pandemic. And the focus was basically on the protection of our students and generally the staff and university and TVET, community college community. And secondly, to look at skills from the scourge of the pandemic, like HIV, AIDS and TB, but also to look at mental health because of the rise of mental health cases, which was a result of anxiety, uncertainty, and also people basically losing their next of kin, and therefore issues around mental health and the interventions necessary thereof became much more urgent. And one of the things that we also witnessed in South Africa in this period was the rise in gender-based violence because students were studying from home, and therefore this became one of the bigger issues, and therefore a response in this regard was important. And so Higher Health was quite instrumental to use all that infrastructure to assist us with both on-campus and technology-based interventions to save lives and assist towards a hybrid approach to teaching and learning. They created what we call Health Check, which is a toll-free COVID risk detection system which was launched via USSD, WhatsApp, and also the web, requiring daily mandatory risk detection with inbuilt contact tracing and linkages to care for affected students, and it was launched in May 2020. Over 1.7 million students are registered on this platform, on this online platform that has helped us to assist our institutions towards COVID-19 outbreaks as residences, campuses, and also early intervention. But this has also assisted us to manage the hybrid educational delivery programs during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we ensured that in the first phase of rollout of our vaccination program, focus on over 250,000 academic and support staff across all our institutions for business continuity. And in the first phase, young people and students were also vaccinated as part of this second phase. And I must say that one of the most challenging things was to persuade even the most literate in our society about the significance and importance of vaccination, but also to manage, when we faced in the reopening of our post-school education and training academic institutions, managing people's resistance towards vaccination and the kind of fears that emanated from that. But I think the one central thing that we learned in our country during that COVID-19 period was that the unequal nature of our education system basically ensured that those who were capable, those who had access to resources, those who had access to data and network, those who had access to gadget, seamlessly transitioned, from the COVID-19 crisis to continue to have, access to education. And that these inequalities were not only amongst institutions, but also within institutions, where students were in the same classrooms, could not, easily transition to the new normal which we were created. And so some of our initiatives included the zero rating of 637 educational websites with the support of the mobile network operators, just-in-time training for lecturers on the integration of appropriate technology into teaching and learning, because we had to transition from one form of pedagogy or delivery into another, where students were more accustomed to contact learning. They had to readjust to online or distance learning. Thirdly, the provision of laptops to students and lecturers in all PSET institutions, and even though we did this with almost success, having to source the gadgets from all over the world, the biggest challenge was obviously access to network and expensive data. And so the provision of data to students and lecturers as part of the engagement with mobile operators in terms of reducing the costs also helped in our case. Now, I started by telling you that I'm from the most unequal country in the world. And therefore, COVID-19 pandemic exposed, as both the reports that I referred to earlier from the World Bank and the European Union, exposed the structural inequalities which were embedded in our history as a country. And with the advent of democracy in 1994, and as a response to this complex legacy of segregation or apartheid, over the past 27 years, we've consistently allocated the biggest share of our national budget to education, and have also made a number of targeted policy and institutional interventions in our education system. In fact, education takes up more than 10% of our national fiscus. These interventions were mainly aimed at increasing the number of women and Africans in educational institutions, and also enhancing the capacity of previously disadvantaged academic institutions to contribute meaningfully to our nation's human capital development need and knowledge production priorities. As a result of these investments, our basic and higher education sectors have grown exponentially over the past 2 decades. We now have over 24,000 public schools, close to 13 million learners, and over 400,000 teachers. That is in terms of basic education. In our higher education sector, 26 public universities, with a plan to build 2 more universities which will specialize on science, technology, and innovation, and also on crime, and an enrollment that has increased from a mere 500,000 in 1994 to over 1.1 million this year. And in 2000, enrollment in our TVET colleges increased from around 200,000. And the plan is to further expand, the TVET sector. It's actually more than 500,000, not 200,000. Currently, over 700,000 students are registered at more than 50 of our TVET colleges. As a sum total of these interventions, today the great majority of the students in our higher education institutions are women and are also African, which we think is a huge landmark and progress given the history of our country. Our long-term objective is to increase university enrollment to 1.5 million by 2030. So what are the next steps? What are the next interventions? And where do we think we need to move to? The challenge obviously remains how to ensure equity and inclusion of all in a world where information communications technology and the 4th Industrial Revolution developments are playing an increasing role in surviving in an ever-changing world, and in education and training, as well as in how we conduct research and innovate. We cannot afford to leave anyone behind. Secondly, increasing demands are being placed on the post-school education and training system to respond to global trends such as online program and course offering, micro-credentials, massive open online courses. multi-institutional online education and training offerings, increasing cross-border education, privatization and commercialization of education and training, and the impact of the fourth industrial revolution. The reality is that open learning and online learning as it is structured assumes that everyone has got access equally to all the resources that are necessary for online learning and distance learning and open learning to take place. And therefore, we have to ensure that we think creatively around how we resolve access, particularly for the most marginalized, for those who are in the townships and those who are in the countryside. Online learning also offers students the ability to participate in a course program when, and in many cases where, it is convenient for them to do so. The numbers I spoke about earlier, increase in terms of participation rate in our universities and TVET colleges, have mainly been as a result of our growing distance education institution, which is the University of South Africa, because it is cheaper, it is more convenient, and that students are able to study at their own pace, but also its history and its endurance and ability to respond to the demand for a new generation which is hungry for post-school education and training. And therefore, investment in this regard as it relates to distance education has been one of the crucial elements in terms of determining the future of participation, inclusion, and equity in the South African post-school education and training system. Furthermore, when students engage in learning through the use of information communication technology, they also become more familiar with technology by using it. So many of the students whom we distributed laptops, iPads, and all forms of electronic gadgets to help them with their learning and teaching were actually having those gadgets for the first time. Yes, we have more than 80% penetration in terms of mobile telephone use, but mostly people who have got access to these use this for voice calls and text messages. And therefore, to use them now for education and training was a significant culture shock to many of them. But we think that with this, it means progress in terms of them familiarizing with this technology and therefore being able to use it for this purpose. It's a critical skill, as I said, which we believe everyone is going to need. And some of the interventions and some of the key questions that we believe remain for us, and not only for us, I think, for for most of us who are in this room, is how do we ensure equity and inclusion of all in this world? How do we as a country, continent, and the world build use the legislative and policy environment that exists, which is well-intentioned, to translate that into tangible intervention that will guarantee equity and that will guarantee access and success. And so we thought about implementing or focusing on 5 important areas. Firstly, access to equality and affordable connectivity, which is one of the things that we consistently are focused on with our engagements with telecoms company, but also the role of a government agency, which is the South African National Research Education Network, which has been rolling out network capabilities to all our TVET colleges and our universities. Secondly, access to ICT infrastructure, particularly for the poorest of the poor, through our National Student Financial Aid Scheme, which is a government bursary. And I must say that their response in this regard to ensure that as many of the students in our universities and TVET colleges have access to these gadgets. Thirdly, the provision of digital content, which is freely available through the National Open Learning System with access to open education resources, or OER. Fourthly, the increase in the capacity of our department to further promote open learning, because we believe that in this way lies the future to ensure broader access, to ensure equity, and to ensure inclusivity. But we also have to build capacity of management and administration, lecturers, and also students. And I think the agility and flexibility of our learning and training, of our learning and teaching abilities to be able to respond to these types of environment is going to be very, very crucial. And also a dynamic and responsive curriculum and program applications, such as the demand-led skilling model for the global business services and ICT industries, approval and accreditation of programs that are responsive to economic needs and employment of the youth, and what is required for the economic growth of our country. At the end of the day, we have experienced similar challenges. They may be varying, but we have experienced similar challenges. And I think the key question is, how do we collectively respond moving forward based on some of the lessons that we have learned? And I think also of crucial importance, how do we make the new normal a thing that we have to continue with in order to ensure that there's endurance, there's longevity in terms of access, inclusivity, and equity of our post-school education and training system, and broadly of our education. Otherwise, if we do not cooperate, I do not think anyone will survive. Thank you very much.